welcome to today's event, Plurality, the Future of Collaborative Technology and Democracy, with Glen Weyl and Paul Sampson. To those of you who are new to the CG community, the Centre for International Governance Innovation is a think tank based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. We're an independent, nonpartisan think tank whose peer-reviewed research and trusted analysis influence policymakers to innovate. We accomplish this through engaging a global network of experts and contributors, primarily tackling governance challenges and opportunities of data and transformative tech and their impact on society. First things first, we'd like to thank you for being here. We're very much looking forward to the presentation and discussion that will follow. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Rianne Cayenne. I am PM of CG's Digital Policy Hub. Today, I'll serve as MC of this event and will walk us through the agenda and some quick housekeeping notes before handing things over to Paul. So again, we are delighted to be joined by Glen Weyl. We're also joined by Paul Sampson, President of CG. Mr. Weyl will present on his recent work on plurality, namely how plurality supports democracy through digital technology and how plurality creates visual pathways with the global community through the digital governance paradigm. This will be followed by a Q&A session. A note for those of you participating virtually, please feel free to send in your questions via the Q&A tool on Zoom. Throughout the discussion, we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to the contact posted in the Zoom chat by our event staff. Without further ado, I'll send it over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Rianne. Glen Weyl, delighted that you can join us today. I'm going to offer a few remarks here to introduce you. It's not easy to succinctly introduce Glen, as there are so many interesting parts to his background. It's a challenge. So here's my attempt. Glen is both a thinker and a doer. He's trained as an economist, and he's leveraged this to become an interdisciplinary thinker across political economy, sociology, computer science, and much more. And he's very much a doer, working to develop technology to empower diversity, cooperation, and widely shared prosperity. Similar to our think tank CG, his goals align with a human plurality that can thrive in a world of accelerating technology disruption. He's the founder of three things that we want to note here: Radical Exchange, which is a global movement for next generation political economies. He is also the founder of Plural Technology Collaboratory, and he is also the founder of Plurality Institute. And he's having an impact. He's widely acknowledged as a shaper of key technologies and emerging technologies, including by Wired magazine. Finally, I would note that he is, the title of the talk today is also the title of his latest book, which is co-authored with Audrey Tang, Minister of Digital Affairs of Taiwan, and is available for free downloads online. So without further ado, over to you, Glen. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Paul. I'm trying to get these slides queued up. I just got back from Brussels. I landed into Boston, where I am, about 2 hours ago. And I came home to find this. So I received the first copy of my book in the mail from Amazon. So I want to tell you about that book today. I was actually in Brussels talking about it as well with a similar group there. And this book is a little bit complex to describe the authorship of, because as you mentioned, Paul, it's joint with Audrey Tang, but it's also joint with about 4 dozen, almost 5 dozen people around the world on every continent, who are reflected in this image here, which both uses what you would call AI, large models, to blend together the images of the people who contributed to the book, and then we tiled it with their individual faces. This is a book which means a lot of different things to different people, which is why I'm going to try to give a relatively brief presentation and then engage you in all the questions, because there's sort of an infinite number of directions in which you can take this material. But the standard framing, the way it's framed in the order of the book, is around the challenges that increasingly I think we face in mostly Western countries about the kind of divide between democracy and technology. On the one hand, many believe that technology is increasingly undermining and eroding democracy, creating polarized groups of people who don't communicate effectively with each other and have antipathy towards each other, making democracy unstable and leading to conflict, disinformation, misinformation, etc. On the other hand, many technologists feel that democracy has become their enemy, that what they hear from the governments of democratic countries is anger, backlash, negativity, and declines in investments by governments in developing technology, exactly when many technologists feel that investment is critical. Whereas from authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, in mainland China, they're seeing massive investment, cooperation with the private sector, the building up of strategic industries, etc. And we believe that the reason behind this, and I'll add a little bit onto my slides here, is really the social divide that exists within liberal democracies between technology and the rest of society. I'll focus in a minute on kind of the ideological manifestations of this, but ultimately, I actually think this goes much deeper than ideology to just the social fabric of how technology is developed. In most of the West, we are used to the notion that technology is developed in a very small set of geographies by overwhelmingly secular, nerdy, white men who are very well off. And they also think in a series of patterns, and this is where it comes to the ideologies that are very different than the rest of society. There are two dominant visions of the future of technology that you hear coming out of Silicon Valley. One is that there's going to be a big computer that's going to do everything for you, and you're going to get a universal basic income. All the problems of the world will be solved, and you can just sort of enjoy whatever you feel like doing. You hear this a lot coming from people like Sam Altman, Nick Bostrom, a lot of the community around AI. We refer to this view as technocracy. We derive these terminology from a game, Civilization VI, the best-selling strategy game of all time, where there are future ideologies. In the modern period, you have communism, democracy, fascism. In the future, you have what they call synthetic technocracy, corporate libertarianism, and digital democracy. And so we kind of modeled how we talk about these around that. Another vision that you hear very frequently is closely associated with the crypto world. This is what we call libertarianism, and it's focused around the notion that advances in technology are going to break down the ability of governments, unions, any collective organization to exercise authority over, an unbridled, hyper-capitalist free market. And this is closely associated with people like Mark Andreessen, Peter Thiel, Balaji Srinivasan, the Bitcoin world. There are books like The Sovereign Individual that articulate it very clearly. And what we believe is that there is a alternative vision, a third vision, one that actually underlies many of the technologies that are most important to our lives these days, like the internet, and to many of the pop cultural expressions of the future, like Star Trek, but that hasn't been as clearly articulated. And the ambition of this book is to try to articulate that vision more crisply. But I think it's really useful to ground this in a real lived alternative. Is there a society that is living out this notion of digital democracy? Is there a society where there isn't this social divide between technologists and the rest of society? And I want to argue that there is, and that Taiwan is perhaps the world's leading example of this. So in Taiwan, there's a movement called GovZero that is spelled out G0V, where the concept is that you take, government websites that are, .gov.tw, and you replace it with .g0v.tw, and you put up alternative versions of the government website that are better. So, there's this notion that you guys have up in Canada, not so much in the US, of a shadow cabinet. Well, this is like a shadow for every government service provided by the civil sector that doesn't need to wait for an election, but instead just starts working for people and then pressures the government to adopt it. And in fact, this creation of these alternative government services became so popular that Audrey, my co-author, who became Minister of Digital Affairs, was entrusted with the job of finding these things and bringing them into the public services. And that was the foundation for them having, during the COVID-19 crisis, the world's lowest death rate, but without any shutdowns, lockdowns of the economy. And so they ended up having the second highest economic growth rate during that crisis period of any country other than Guyana, which discovered oil at the time. They've also harnessed this to address another critical crisis facing the world, the infodemic. So according to VDEM, the Swedish think tank, they have, by a couple of orders of magnitude, the most disinformation per capita entering and attacking the country for obvious reasons. And yet, on January 13th this year, they had an election launching this year of global elections that was viewed pretty broadly as one of the freest, fairest, most successful, and most consensual elections for quite some time in the whole world. And they also have built a platform, vTaiwan, where citizens use a sort of Twitter-like interface, but with a different way of serving content to reach consensus and recommend to the government actions around contentious policy issues, like the regulation of street electronic ride-hailing. This system uses advanced computer modeling, things like ML and AI, to cluster opinions and then provide a perspective on what are the approaches that transcend the divisions within the conversation, rather than highlighting the things that inflame a particular side of that division. Now, these are like a bunch of really interesting programs, but then you can ask, like, well, how does that show up in data? Like, what is Taiwan's actual performance? And I think that this is sort of equally remarkable. So if you adjust for purchasing power parity, Taiwan has the highest median income, the highest typical living standard of any country with more than 10 million people in the world. And it has the most technology-intensive economy in the world. So about 40% of the GDP of Taiwan comes from the export of technology, which is really quite remarkable, because even in a country like the US, which you think of as this very tech-intensive economy, only about 10% of people work in even the broadest conception of the digital sector. So, you've got a country where basically the median occupation is, being in a semiconductor fab. And yet, while lots of people fear that the, adoption of technology will lead to rising inequality, reducing labor share of income, Taiwan has actually seen over the last decade a decline in its Gini coefficient, or steady, and similarly steady or rise in its labor share of national income. And at the same time, depending on exactly which evaluator you look at, Taiwan is either the world's best democracy along many standard measures, or the best democracy in Asia. And so the reaction I usually get to this is, well, it's this little homogeneous island nation, you know, blah, 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 blah. But I actually think that it could hardly be further from the truth. In fact, in 2014, the National Parliament of Taiwan was occupied by student protesters. Not for the 3 hours that it was occupied in the United States, but for 3 weeks. So you can imagine how much division that must have caused within Taiwanese society and how deep the divides must have been for this to occur. The approval rating of the government at the time was 9%. And even a decade later, when they've used all these tools that I've talked about to heal these divisions, the fundamental conception of what that island is so different between the political groups in the country. So the day before the January 13th election, I was in the country and I went to the rallies of the major parties. On the right here, you can see the ruling party. There was not a single national flag at the whole rally. Everything was green, rainbow, or pictures of the island. And I went to the opposition party, and there all the flags were the Taiwanese flag. So you have a party ruling the country that does not recognize the name of the country or the flag of the country. And you have an opposition that is, you know, from the minds of the ruling party, waving the flag, wrapping themselves in the flag of what would effectively be like if, you know, the conservatives in Canada were, you know, waving the Union Jack rather than the Canadian maple leaf. So like that is the background that you have here. And it's not just political and identity divisions that pervade Taiwan. Taiwan is the second most religiously pluralist country in the world, and the third most religiously devoted developed country in the world, and one of the only developed countries where actually religious observance has been on the rise. So you've got this profoundly religious, profoundly diversely religious country. And the ethnic background is also quite mind-boggling. So until 1600, the only people inhabiting that island were people of Polynesian origin. It then became a colony of the Dutch, then became part of the Chinese Empire. Actually, 2 different Chinese empires fought over it. And then it was part of the Japanese Empire in the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. So you've got all these crazy things stirring around. And you might ask, won't that lead to awful conflict? And in fact, it can. So Audrey, just about a month ago, escaped an assassination attempt, the first assassination attempt on a minister by a gunman in Taiwan's history. But it used to be that when we saw explosions coming from the ground, we would try to put them out. And now we drill for oil underneath them. And this is really the key insight, I think, that underlies what they've been able to accomplish in Taiwan. There is potential energy in social diversity. Yes, it can explode into conflict, but it can also be harnessed. And it is the critical role of digital technology to harness the energy latent in social diversity, just as industrial technology harnessed the energy that was latent in fossil fuels and atomic technology that was latent in, you know, the configuration of atoms. This we sometimes draw it from the expression, the Vulcan philosophy in Star Trek of infinite diversity and infinite combinations, which they express as the idea that all beauty, growth, and progress come from the union of the unlike. And we can relate this more to sort of mainstream philosophical thinking using these three thinkers that I've put up here, who represent three different aspects of what we mean by this idea of plurality. So the first is Hannah Arendt, the great mid-century European Jewish philosopher, who used the word plurality in her book, The Human Condition, to denote the concept that we shouldn't primarily think of the world as being sort of a social whole and then atomized individuals, but instead intersecting diverse social groups and the individuals whose identities they constitute. And we denote that by this symbol here, this interlocking squares, showing this concept of kind of overlapping social groups. Second idea is one, so that's an idea about how the world is. Second idea is about what makes for a good society. And we draw this from Danielle Allen, arguably the leading political philosopher of our time, Harvard professor, MacArthur Fellow, double PhD. And in her work on a connected society, she argued that we need to see the key definition of a successful society as its ability to harness, rather than to dissipate in conflict, the energy laden in social diversity. And we represent that by these rainbow squares that emerge from that intersection of those two squares. And finally, what we associate with Audrey's thought is the notion that the key role of digital technology is to build those engines that harness the energy of social diversity, just as industrial technology built engines that harness the energy laden in fossil fuels. And we denote that by these two Chinese characters, shu wei, which mean both digital and plural in the traditional Mandarin that they use in Taiwan. So Audrey is the digital minister, but she's also the minister of pluralism, which fits her well because she's also the first non-binary minister of government anywhere in the world. And that non-binariness is part of her gender identity, but it's also a part of how she approaches everything, to try to see difference, see distinction, and also find the overlap and connection between them. So what would it take to build a digital world that embodies this notion? Well, you need a digital technological representation of this conception of people as part of diverse and intersecting communities. And there actually is a very straightforward formalism for that in graph theory. It's called the concept of a hypergraph. A hypergraph is like a social network that you're used to, but rather than there just existing links between pairs of individuals, there are social communities that connect many people. And that's what I've pictured here. And I think that what we argue in the book is that the fundamental structure of a plural society has to be to make the representation of these facts of social life the equivalent in the digital world of human rights in the traditional conception of democracy. So there need to be open protocols that are guaranteed to everyone access as a human right, not as a proprietary service, that embody the different core aspects of this diagram here. People need to be able to represent their identity, their personhood, as part of those fundamental protocols. They need to be able to form associations with other people where they share information and have it protected from outside surveillance as a fundamental human right affordance of the system. They need to be able to engage in common action with those people, to hold things like data and computation together, and to engage in commercial activities as a fundamental open feature human right of the system. And access to those systems needs to be made universally available as a human right. And we believe that that was actually the original vision of the internet, that the communication protocols, the open communication protocols that constitute the internet were a first prototype for how you could build this whole suite of human rights into open protocols available to all, but that we kind of stopped short of that. And we're now starting in the movement for digital public infrastructure that many of you may be familiar with to pick back up the baton of completing that agenda of building this open set of protocols that are the foundations of a digital, shui, pluralistic society. On those foundations, we can then build the core of what plurality aspires to, namely collaboration across social difference. And we can push back the frontiers of what is possible in terms of that collaboration across social difference. So there's a paradox inherent to collaboration across difference, which is that obviously it will always be easier to collaborate more closely with a small set of people who is similar to you than with a large group of people who are very different from you. And there are many different modalities as a result of that, of interaction that we have in society today. So intimacy is how we label interaction between a small number of people that is very deep. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's capitalism, which is a very thin way of interacting, but that stretches across really everyone on the planet, effectively. And in between, we can see there being a whole spectrum of different interaction modes that trade off this depth of connection and the breadth. We can roughly quantify the breadth by the number of people who participate, though really you should think about it in terms of sort of diversity, physical distance, all the things that divide us. And then we can quantify depth by the bandwidth of that communication. So capitalism reduces everything to money. Everything's like a number. Voting, you express yourself on a range of issues, so it's more like a vector. Bureaucracies have you fill out forms, do structured communications. It's not quite numbers, but it has quite a lot of structure. Conversations are richer than that. When we do co-authorship and creative co-creation, we usually engage a sense more fully than we can in conversation. We make music together, we make paintings together, etc. But even deeper than that is multisensory immersive experiences we have together, going to a party or a religious celebration, etc. And then even beyond that, in intimacy, we share things that are even richer than our sensory experiences with each other. We share our internal sense of ourselves, what's sometimes called proprioception, what gives us an understanding of our own bodies internally with another person. And the goal of plurality is that at every point along this spectrum, we can push back this trade-off, allowing deeper connections with people across a broader range of diversity and more participants. You can see on this diagram sort of all the different modalities that allow that. You can push intimacy to remote post-symbolic communication, co-presence to immersive shared realities, co-authorship to creative digital collaboration, conversations to augmented deliberations, bureaucracies to adaptive administration, voting to plural voting, and capitalism to social markets. But to give you a sense for why these are all part of the same project, I want to take two opposite extreme examples here. One that's like crazily futuristic, involves all kinds of technology, seems way out there, and another that seems very mundane, but would still be, you know, an innovation, doesn't require much digital, etc. And I want to show you how the basic structure of what these aim to achieve is the same. And it is this notion of empowering more social diversity while allowing us to cooperate more richly across that social diversity. Okay, so the first example I want to give is brain-to-brain direct interface, which is big topic in technology these days. This would allow the direct sharing of our subjective experiences with another person rather than mediating it through even immersive shared reality technologies. And obviously, this would allow sort of a level of intimacy, a level of connection across people that has never been possible, far deeper than even in-person interactions could ever achieve. And so it allows for very, very deep connections. And yet, I would argue it also may allow for much more diversity. And why is that? Well, we know that children, I have a 2-year-old and a 5-year-old, are very creative, and they often lose a lot of that creativity, that sort of pluripotency of being a child as they grow older, because they have to communicate with other people, and they can't make sense, make real to the world those things. If they were able to directly share their imaginations, perhaps more of that diversity, more of that potential in a child could persist into adulthood. Let me go to a complete opposite end of the spectrum. So there's a technique called approval voting, which is very, very simple. It's just like standard voting, but rather than vote for one candidate, you can vote for as many as you want. And the candidate with the most votes wins. So this, I would claim, actually has exactly the same logic. So the idea is that the candidates that are eventually chosen have greater consensus around them. Usually someone who wins in approval voting has like 75% support, 80% support. And at the same time, it allows for much greater diversity because there's no spoiler effects. You can run as a small additional party, and you can get votes and maybe eventually even win without worrying that you're going to detract from one of the leading candidates. So, you know, I know you guys use the first past the post rule to elect candidates in constituencies, and that's led you to mostly be dominated by two large parties. But you could, under approval voting, have people support both the NDP and the Liberals and the Greens. They could approve all three of those. And then whoever got the most votes in a riding in approval would end up being elected. And so again, these two very different things are, we would argue, part of the same project because they're both allowing for greater diversity and greater cooperation across that diversity. And because of the breadth of these different approaches, we believe that these technologies can transform every sector of the economy: healthcare, energy, the environment, etc. And let me try to give you a few concrete examples of that. So first, in healthcare, many cancers are primarily an issue of detection. So breast cancer, for example, if detected early, can almost always be prevented at low cost. However, it's very hard to do that early detection, or it's very invasive to do it. And why is that so hard? Well, the quality of our ability to read mammograms is not particularly high. It is quite well understood that if we had access to the billions of mammograms that have been taken, that we could overcome this problem. The issue is that medical privacy makes sharing that data and therefore training models on it very hard. If we had a way to privately and securely share large databases, effectively we could cure breast cancer without even any fundamental medical advance. That sort of cooperation that preserves privacy and allows us to do these ambitious collaborations is therefore at the core of addressing many diseases. Second example, I used to work for the office of the Chief Technology Officer at Microsoft. And we had a relatively small team. We were the ones who ran the OpenAI investment that had to go around the company figuring out what is the common infrastructure that people across the company need in order to keep up with the disruptions that are coming. But because we were this tiny group of people, basically 100 people serving an organization of 200,000, there was no way we could understand what all the emergent possibilities were. And we became this bottleneck for innovation and organizational adaptation. If instead we use some of these tools to actually support decentralized groups of people coming together, figuring out what their organizations need, matching the investment, the small investments that each organization makes, if it's for something that commonly serves all of them, you could have a fundamental change to the way the organization works. Rather than all these separated organizations and then the centralized group trying to figure out what they need, you could actually empower people to come together across the organization, form new things that serve all of their needs without some centralized bottleneck. In addressing the environment, we believe that one of the most fundamental reasons why we have the environmental problems we have is that environmental problems don't respect jurisdictional boundaries. Rivers flow across countries. Pollution blows across the strait between Taiwan and the mainland. And therefore, we need new emergent jurisdictions that can speak for those environmental problems. We need to be able to form new types of governance entities and allow them to speak and be represented. And that is really the core of plural technologies, all the way from training LLMs to represent data about the environment and actually literally be like a Lorax speaking for the trees, to forming new jurisdictions through the collaboration of people across different countries. And finally, our media environment right now, the social media environment, is dominated by serving to people things that engage them, that excite them, that titillate them, that they want to react to, which often leads people to have a false impression that the relatively fringe views that they and a circle of people around them have are broadly held. You could instead imagine an architecture where the things that bring people together with communities are highlighted, uplifted, and the community that they unite is reflected back to people. So people know that this piece of content is sort of consensual and viewed as factual across, say, the United States, this piece across the Catholic Church, this piece within a particular political party within a country, etc. And you might ask, why would something that's trying to serve you advertisements want to be giving you that fair and balanced understanding of the nature of the content you're receiving? And advertisement is not a model that really supports that, but what could is a new model where organizations like churches, like local governments, support social media. And instead of advertisements diverting the focus from whatever excites people, instead what could be uplifted is those things that bring people together within those communities. Okay, what policies would we need to adopt to make this the future? I want to argue that there are three models for technology policy that we hear a lot about, but that there's a fourth one that's much more appealing. So we hear a lot about the China model, which can be caricatured as the government controlling and directing technology. a lot about the US model, which can be caricatured as, let the free market rip. And a lot about the European model, which can be caricatured as, no, bad, stop, don't do all these harmful things. And what we want to argue is that a much more productive approach takes something from each of these. So we need to take from the Europeans that fundamental respect and commitment to civil society and human rights. From China, we need to take the notion that the government has an active role to play as an investor. And from the US, the notion that decentralization and entrepreneurship and bottom-up energy and positive building are what will get us to those goals. And that's really what the Taiwanese model does. The government provides active investment and support for the civil sector to liberate it from the need to just serve profit and instead allow it to build the foundations of digital democracy and digital human rights. And how was Taiwan able to find this? Well, as some of you may have seen, there was a big earthquake in Taiwan about a month ago. And that's because it sits at the intersections of the Eurasian and Pacific tectonic plates. And that's why it has this mountain on top of it that is the highest point in East Asia. But if you have good earthquake technology, if you have good digital resilience technology, like they had these asynchronous satellites not controlled by Elon Musk, but created by Taiwan to ensure that they would have resilience even if there were unnatural reasons why their internet went down. If you have those, then even when you have a giant earthquake like this, not that many people die, the internet only goes down for a couple minutes. Similarly, if you have thoughtful approaches, if you have sophisticated, pluralistic ways of dealing with these, actually all these tensions between Europe and China and the US allow Taiwan to emerge with this synthetic model that we believe outperforms the others. But to make that a reality, to support that kind of investment and decentralization requires every social sector to be involved. We need the public to be understanding and demanding and participating in defining that vision of the future that they want, because otherwise it won't be civil-led. It will be led by a small group of technocrats. And that requires cultural institutions like the Muraikon Museum in Japan, which has these incredible exhibits. That's the Museum of Emerging Technology that really bring the public in to the process of defining the future rather than leaving them as recipients from the tech sector of whatever is invented. We need films like this film I'm executive producer of about Audrey's life. I was hoping to show you guys a trailer for it, but it doesn't quite have the copyright permissions yet. But it's a remarkable film by an Oscar-winning documentary director, Cynthia Wade. We need governments like the state in the state of Colorado, in India, building digital infrastructure and adopting these new ways of governing and participating. We need technology companies like Anthropic and OpenAI that are harnessing these tools to define the behavior of their systems, and like Gitcoin, which is using it to support the development of open source software around the world. And we need academic institutions to build a research field around this, as Plurality Institute is trying to do, and organizations like the IE University in Spain are building institutes around. So I hope some of you will be inspired to participate. This QR code will let you go to the website to download the book for free, but not just as readers. We want everyone to be a co-creator, a participant in this. And that's the reason why the book is fully open source. It's not just copyright free, to our knowledge, the first copyright free book of this kind ever, but it is open for you to contribute to. And starting now, I am not in charge of what even makes it into the book. The community is collectively deciding on that using the tools that we describe in the book. There is a ledger created on the open source repo that records everyone's contributions and then gives them the right to govern the future democratic evolution of the project using some of the tools we describe in the book, like plural voting, plural funding, auctions, prediction markets, so that they can choose what changes they want to have made, what directions they want to have for the improvement of the project, etc. And we don't want this to just be reflected in the way we build the content, but also the way we message it. So we've used something that we call plural marketing to pursue the way we distribute this, the engagements we do, the media we address. And I'll give you an illustration of this from the endorsements that we've gotten for the book. So what is plural marketing? The idea is that we define an audience, and then we try to think about what are the social divides that exist within that audience. And then we try to look for a vector of influence or to bring the message that spans across those divides. And then within each of the divides, we recursively reapply this, looking for what are the divides within that and what's someone who spans across that. So to give you a sense for this, the Dalai Lama, this is the first secular book that he's endorsed for a quarter century. So because we believe he's a figure that spans across the divides of culture, politics, business, and research. And then within each of those areas, we have a figure that spans across it. So we have Anne Applebaum in culture, Tsai Ing-wen, the outgoing president of Taiwan, in politics, Vitalik Buterin in business, Danielle Allen in research. And then again, we divide again. So within culture, there's secular and religious. Politics, there's the West and the rest. And I'll give you a sense of these people. So we have Johnny Moore, who is the top evangelical advisor to President Trump, endorsing. We also have Holly Herndon, who is probably the most respected AI artist. Within politics, we have Obi Ezekwesili, who's one of the leading African politicians, Stav Shafir, who founded the Israeli social justice protests that led to the Occupy movement. Within business, there's technology and non-technological things. So there's Frank McCourt, founder of McCourt Global, and Ori Okolo Mwangi, who is one of the leading technologists in Africa. And in research, there's humanities, social sciences, and sciences. So we have Michael I. Jordan, who's been defined by Science magazine as the most influential computer scientist in the world, Drone Acemoglu, perhaps the most famous economist in the world, and Karatani Kojan, who is one of the leading Marxist historians. So that gives you a sense of the diversity of the ways that we're trying to bring this story to the audiences. And with that, I think I will leave you with this QR code to scan if you want to participate and take some questions from the audience.
So much for your presentation. Very insightful. I know that the Plurality open source book is on the Hub reading list, so we encourage viewers here to take a look. So thank you very much.
And if you want a physical version, it will be available to purchase on Amazon May 20th. So
perfect. Thank you very much. We'll take it over to Paul for some comments and then open up Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much, Glenn. This was absolutely fascinating, and really appreciate the visualizations as well that you had in your presentation. I've got a couple of comments that could lead to questions. If you really want to respond to those, that would be fantastic. The first one was that I think you said you were in Taiwan when the election took place at the beginning of 2024. And I just wondered if there was anything else you were going to say or wanted to say about the third party, the Taiwan's People's Party, TPP, that emerged to be more significant in the elections and the role of the youth in that. My question would be, was there a link to this notion of digital democracy? Most of the discussion was around they did a better job of being more pragmatic, more linked to the economy and cost of living and education and things that younger people were thinking about. Was there also a digital democracy component that was playing out there a bit that you could speak to further? So should I just stop with that and see if
that would be great. Yeah, that's a fabulous question, a very detailed question. Let me try to give just a little bit of background so that other people can follow it. So in the Taiwanese election, there have mostly been two parties. One, which is that opposition party I showed you, usually called it the Blues, who view themselves as a free part of China. So they view themselves as Chinese, but they want, Taiwan's free version of China to be the vision of the future of China. Then there's the Greens, who think of themselves as a different place, as an independent island. And the usual divide in Taiwanese politics has been between those two sides. In this election, for the first time, a sort of centrist third force emerged called the Taiwan People's Party, which was sort of did not really want to engage in this debate about what Taiwanese identity is. They wanted to focus on more domestic issues. And that party won some seats in parliament, not a ton. It won about 15% of the seats in parliament. It also won about 25% of the vote in the election. As you noted, Paul, their primary focus was on, we're going to focus on domestic issues and get past these divides, not really about digital democracy. They did engage the youth a lot, but that was their primary focus. What I would say is that I think that there's a lot more potential if a third party like that were to draw on these issues than what they actually managed to achieve. I think they didn't have a very coherent story about what their ideology was, other than like, we're going to get past this usual thing, but like they didn't have any positive thing they were going to get past it too. And I think that really hurt them. So I do think there's a real possibility of a future of a party emerging in the future that has that feeling to it, but harnesses the set of people that the TPP did, and I think that could very well win. But the people who are likely to find the seeds of that are actually in the two main parties. So the number 3 person who was elected on the list, you guys don't have this exactly in Canada, but they have like an open, what's called the open list PR system. So or at least that's part of the system. So they have like a list, and you have different positions on that list. And the third person on the list for the opposition party was someone who ran explicitly on a plurality platform, and is like one of the leaders in the community in Taiwan. And the number 2 person on the ruling party list was someone who did the same. So they're actually, neither of them were in the TPP, in this third party, but both of them are kind of united, and they're working very closely together and with us on advancing these ideas even further and addressing what was a concern in the election, which was that there was this third party that may have sort of, by detracting votes from the blue camp, led the green leader to win. And so there's quite a lot of energy for taking some of these innovations that Audrey's done in the digital ministry and really bringing them to the core of the Taiwanese electoral system because of what happened in the election. But I wouldn't say that the TPP itself is like a central leader in that process, because I think they're just kind of incubating the idea of a third party focused around getting past the existing divides rather than having a positive vision. So
Thanks a lot for sharing that, Glenn. I'm just going to keep going with a couple more, if I may, because we're still good for time. The second thing I wanted to raise was decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, that you've written about elsewhere. I don't think you mentioned it at all on your slides. But decentralized autonomous organizations are a governance innovation. They, to some degree, can operate in an independent or autonomous manner because they have some kind of tokenization that relates to the governance system. Now, I guess the question to you here now is that, do you see these DAOs as being an essential ingredient for the kind of vision that you outlined, or is that just one possible mechanism that could help support this vision you outlined? Could you say a little more on DAOs?
thanks. So there's a much older idea than a DAO, which is some kind of emergent transnational, democratically governed cooperative organization. That concept has been around at very least since John Dewey in the 1920s, and probably well before that. And I definitely think there's a bunch of ways in which technology enables that. So it enables people to communicate better. It enables them to, as you said, through tokens, vote, and so forth. And we used all of that in making the book. You could describe the book as being DAO-like organization. That being said, I don't really love the framing of DAOs particularly, because a lot of it is around like, it's self-executing, there's no people involved and whatever. And I think that's kind of garbage. Like, I don't think that's actually what makes them work or what's interesting about them. What's interesting about them is that they have a bunch of tools that enable remote collaborations so that you don't need to go through all the standard structures of a nation state in order to have democratic participation at scale. So that's really cool. But I don't think, quote, autonomy, unquote, is really like, or at least the fact that it's self-executing is really critical to that. Much more critical to that, actually, would be governments supporting that form of organization. And the state of Wyoming did that, and they did it for DAOs. But I don't think you had to do it for DAOs in particular. It's just that right now it's very, very hard to actually have, say, an open source community that has a legal presence and that is supported by governments. And that makes, the provision of digital public goods very, very challenging. That's a huge problem. That's something that governments need to help empower. And that type of a formation is very desirable. Whether you call it a DAO, whether you like its attachment to like blockchains and money and whatever, I think is totally beside the point. I think what's necessary is supporting not profit-driven, democratically governed, transnational organization.
Thanks. One last one from me right now anyway. You mentioned open source and you mentioned the uniqueness of your book, which I think is fascinating. I encourage people to participate as well as you did. And I think that's a grand experiment that deserves huge recognition. But the broader question of open source is hotly debated right now, right? And one example would be the release of Meta's Llama 3 just over the last couple of days. But more broadly, which is an open source AI tool, generative AI. But more broadly, there's a hot debate about how far can you go on open source. Is it something that is a universal, truth that open source will be better? Are you suggesting that, or are you just operating in a more narrow?
No, I think there's a lot of limitations to open source and how it's traditionally been done. And they have to do with the fact that it can be a little bit ungoverned. That's a big problem with open source. And that's the big problem for a variety of reasons. It's a big problem because it means that the UX ends up sucking, usually. It's like a cool tool that someone just throws out there, but like people don't actually like to use it. It doesn't have a good funding model to support people being contributors there. It doesn't, and it doesn't have a model, a good way to ensure that whatever's being put out there has integrity and compliance and so forth. So those are major problems that need to be overcome. And I do believe that a lot of the things that we have added or proposed in the book make significant progress towards achieving those goals. And I think open source is a really interesting starting point. It's a really interesting provocation that it's possible to develop digital technologies in the public interest rather than in the, in a commercial interest. But I don't think that it is the be all and end all, or as it's usually conceived as the be all and end all. I think that there are many other very interesting models and starting points. Open source is one of them, but it has a lot of problems. All of these things have lots of problems, and I think there are very important things to learn from open source, and there are very important evolutions on that model to continue to make, rather than just to be satisfied with it. And I don't, it's very easy in this world for everything to turn into like one more stupid polarized debate. Like, when we were going through this book process, I can't tell you how much sort of dismissiveness, hate, and bad treatment we got from the publishing industry, because they were no one in the publishing industry was willing to deal with the fact that we wanted to make this available to people, But the natural way that people then react is they're like, I hate the publishing industry, tear down the cathedral, like screw all these people, there should be no copyright, like that's the usual. And like, that's not the right reaction. Like, yes, I think it was closed-minded and problematic that there is no pathway to do the sort of thing we did, because I think it's a very important thing to explore. But that doesn't mean that I think we should abolish copyright, or that we shouldn't be rewarding creators, or that the only way to do things is be a hacker and unpaid and whatever. We need to respect creators and all the value that they add, and we need to evolve their model, which is very broken in a number of ways, just as we evolve the problems that exist in the open source space. We need to be reaching across those divides. We need to be innovating by taking the best from different things and not just throwing hatred at each other, you know?
That's great. Thanks so much for those comments. Rianne, back to you.
Okay, so we have several questions here. We'll start with a comment, actually, not a question. So Jenna says, G0V, or zero-hour government, is pronounced exactly the same as provisional government in Mandarin. What a good and creative way to showcase digital democracy.
So I did not know that, but I have to say I'm constantly discovering like really, really clever linguistic and semiotic things that Audrey does. So I'll give you one example of this that I think is just like unbelievably brilliant. So the word Taiwan, the name Taiwan, which is one of the names for the jurisdiction that Audrey serves, comes from a Polynesian language and means meeting place in that Polynesian language. If you take the Chinese characters for Republic of China, which is the other name for that jurisdiction, if you literally translate them, it's among cultures, citizen nation. And so she reads that as Transcultural Republic of Citizens, which is a very different way than it's usually done. And that's very similar to a meeting place, like a place of intersection. And so that's another sort of play on words that you know Audrey did to try to bridge this divide over whether is it the Republic of China or is it this independent country, Taiwan. So
interesting. Okay, so the first question from the chat, AI is central to the disagreements between those in synthetic technocracy and corporate libertarianism, the former advocating caution, the latter acceleration. Is digital democracy associated with a particular stance regarding AI, or is the point to enable people to surface their own views?
That's a great question. What I would say is that it's on. Audrey often says, and this comes from Taoism, that it's often easiest to be on all sides of a conflict, not on no sides of a conflict. And so I would say we're both. Like we both think that technology is reckless and antisocial in the way that it's being developed, and that it's going too slow. And the reason that those can both be true is precisely because of what I said about the social divide that exists. Because there is this adversarial relationship between technology and society, the technologies that get developed are socially harmful, but also there isn't the social support for developing them in the right direction. So we need more investment to accelerate the development of pro-social technology. And we need to, through doing that, steer things away from the destructive directions that technology can take. You know, when there is a broken marriage, you don't spend the time arguing about who is right. You spend the time healing the relationship. And I think the acceleration versus deceleration debate is a debate over who's right, not an attempt to heal the relationship between technology and society.
Thank you. And this next question ties in well with the last. How can we ensure that new technologies for collaboration and decision-making are accessible and beneficial to marginalized or underrepresented groups?
Well, I think you need to start by reaching out the hands and including them in the process of development of those technologies. And I will maybe say something a little provocative rather than just healing, which is that I think the most underrepresented group in the West in technology development is deeply religious people.
Mhm.
And by the way, deeply religious people are disproportionately women and minorities as well. So it's actually very consistent with the usual narrative about D and I as well, but it's a more inclusive way of framing it because it brings in people who are from a different political perspective than the usual D and I conversation. And this to me is one of the most striking differences between Asia in technology and the West. In Asia, people who are in the tech world are actually more religious on average than the rest of the population. And religion is viewed as a key complementary component in the development of technology. Whereas the usual thing in the tech world in the West is this neo-atheist rationalist attitude, which is dismissive of religion, which idolizes computers, instead of viewing them as ways to bring to life the spiritual world around us. So I, and above us. And I think healing that divide, bringing in participation and inclusion and religious perspectives and regions that are not included is central if we're going to bring technology in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Further on that, what are some potential drawbacks or limitations of relying on collaborative tech to address complex social problems, and how can they be mitigated?
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of ways in which collaborative technology can go wrong. I think often other collaborative technologies are critical to addressing those limitations. So, like, let me give you two contrasting examples there. On the one hand, if you develop immersive shared reality technologies, there's huge potential for them to give people the ability to empathize with each other, to connect with each other, and there's huge potential to create a corporate controlled metaverse that immerses people, takes them away from all their social responsibilities, and becomes Ready Player One or Snow Crash. And in fact, it's particularly distressing that Meta decided to name itself after the metaverse and Snow Crash, which is actually a total dystopian outcome where society collapses. Everyone is, reduced to basically being a slave to corporations because of how immersive the world is and how little they're involved in their social and political processes. But to me, a key answer to that worry is precisely having more engaging, more advanced governance technologies that enable people to more completely express themselves and therefore avoids the dominations by corporate interests of the rest of the world. So there's a case where advancing in one technology has major risks, but actually advancing in another one helps mitigate some of those risks. Similarly, I think that many advanced voting tools are very exciting ways to potentially govern things, but voting is still very thin. It doesn't really allow people to co-participate in developing different futures. It just gives people a way to express themselves on a set of options that has been laid out by other people. And to address that, I think immersive shared reality technologies can be very powerful because, for example, you can put people inside of a virtual space, and they can co-design a building together, reach consensus, and experiment with what it would be like to be in that space together. And rather than just doing participatory budgeting on money, they can actually interact with the limits that the physical reality puts on them in real time, reshaping the world around them as they do. So that's a case where here are two very different types of technologies for collaboration, each of which has major pitfalls, and yet they can complement each other and help address the problems that each one creates.
Thank you. And I actually have a follow-up to that. So
Please.
based on some of the hesitations we discussed for adopting wide-scale collaborative technology for governance. What do you think would help precipitate the widespread adoption? Would it be like funding youth initiatives to inform tech literacy, funding startups, or is it just kind of an attack on all fronts approach?
Yeah, so if you want to have a plural future, there's never going to be a single way there. You have to be pluralistic in your approach to getting there. And it has to span all those different sectors of society that I was talking about. You need cultural investment and cultural activation to help people imagine and co-imagine what that future is they want. You need governments to adopt it in the way that they are operating, but also to fund the development of it. You need academics to form, research and visions of what is possible that all those things can then support and explain. You need businesses to build the tools so people can experiment with them and can also build them into their business product. Like, all those things need to happen. And that might sound overwhelming, and in some ways it is. But, it's also the case that if there's no one silver bullet, everyone has a way to contribute. So that's how I like to think about it. Wherever you are, whatever social sector you're in, there's a critical, necessary part that you have to play in making a future like that possible.
Fantastic, thank you. We do have a few more questions. Can Taiwan's technology innovation leadership, including semiconductors, serve as a practical shield against a future possible cross-strait invasion?
So in Taiwan, they often, I showed you, they have that mountain, Yushan. And because of that mountain, it creates a weather pattern where Taiwan gets, a very moderate climate. It's like a rain shadow on the country. And so they describe Yushan as protecting the country. And they call the semiconductor industry the economic Yushan, because the world's need for semiconductors protects Taiwan from invasion. And I like to describe plurality as the, ideological Yushan for the country. That if we can tell people the story of Audrey, if we can tell people the story of digital democracy, then maybe that can build the space in the hearts of people, in the free world for Taiwan that, say Israel has in the hearts of Jewish people, and therefore defend it against geopolitical challenges that it might face.
Thank you. And next, are there attributes of countries or communities that you think are associated with the ability to successfully adopt digital democracy?
Well, I think that when you have a cauldron of a lot of diversity and a really strong reason why you need to get together to bridge that diversity, to confront common challenges, that's when I think you get the most exciting advances. And I think that's what Taiwan had. It had all this diversity, and yet it also had a common threat. And when you put those things together, I think you get a lot of progress. And I think you've seen that as well in Eastern Europe. So, Ukraine is an incredibly diverse country that has had a very hard time forming a national identity. But with the common threat, they've made a huge amount of advance in digital democracy recently. Similar things can be said about Estonia and many of the Baltic countries. So I think that combination of heterogeneity, diversity, and the need to accomplish common goals is a precipitating thing. And to the extent we can simulate that, and we can draw out the diversity of our societies and at the same time create a sense of the need to address real common problems, using cultural techniques and so forth, I think that's what will help motivate progress on this in Western democracies.
Thank you. And with that, are there any plans for, the book's not even officially out yet, but are there any plans to continue this work? Like, what is next for the Plurality project? Do you have another nation that you would like to dive deep into on this?
So the answer is there is no one direction. It's many, 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 many things, and I'm happy to tell you about some of them. So first of all, we're embarking on a 6-continent, 4-month tour beginning May 20th, that will especially track all the elections that are happening around the world, going to places before their elections. And in almost every place we're stopping, we're helping launch an initiative there. So Audrey's previous trip to the US before the one that she took when she visited Canada led to the launch of all of these democratic AI things that happened. So the Anthropic and OpenAI, et cetera. She was just in Canada and she did a number of things there, but we're going to Spain and launching a new Institute for AI for Democracy there. We're going to France and launching an institute at Sciences Po. We're going to Finland and launching a project around like a lot of the things that Audrey has done in Taiwan that they're starting in there. Everywhere we go, we're trying to build initiatives that are enduring. And Audrey is transitioning from role as digital minister to an ambassador at large role, where she is going to just go around the world and help countries in every region launch these things. But we have initiatives in Africa. We have initiatives in all different parts of Asia. We have initiatives in Europe, as I was mentioning, in South America, really everywhere. We want to try to build institutions around this type of thing because we need a global network to help support this. But that's just governmental type things. We have this documentary that I mentioned that's coming out. We're trying to raise funds for a biopic about her life that will tell that story. We're working with museums. We're working with academic institutions. In every sector, we're trying to do things, and we can't do it all ourselves. We're building a network of people who are doing it, as I showed you from those endorsers. So.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's all the questions that we have from the audience. I don't know if you have any more comments before we wrap up. But we would like to thank you very much for your time. And yeah, we sincerely appreciate it. Hope to have you back soon. And we are posting some resources in the chat here to check out the website, the project, and to learn more.
Awesome. Thank you so much.